हो रहा है उसमें भी तबसरे हो सकते हैं, बहुत सारी राय दी गई है, समझते नहीं अच्छा है, कोई समझता अच्छा है, चलें ठीक है, उससे फर्क फिर भी नहीं पड़ेगा। ये कानून बरकरार नहीं रह सकता है अगर ये आईनी नहीं है, खत्म। और चाहे कानून जो भी अच्छा हो बुरा हो फिर भी बरकरार रहेगा अगर आईनी है, तो बात तो वहीं आगे ठहरती है। मगर अगर वजूहात पे जब जाते हैं ना कि क्यों किया, तो क्यों किया में तो फिर बहुत सारी वजूहात हैं और वो जहां तक बताई गई हैं, और मेरी जाती राय में एक अच्छी वजूहात दी गई हैं। अब उनकी नीयत क्या थी, नीयत तो कोई नहीं देखता है ना, वो तो ऊपर वाले भी नियतों में आप नहीं जाते हो ना। वो लोगों ने कलमे पढ़े जब उनका गर्दन तलवार के नीचे थी, तो मगर फिर भी उन्हें पढ़ लिया तो बात खत्म हो गई थी। तो अब हम उधर नियतें क्यों जा रहे हैं, हम सीधे आईनी बात है, छोटी सी बात है, इसका इतना हमने लंबा इसको खींच रहे हैं, अच्छा है बुरा है, ऐसा है किया वैसा किया है। तो और दूसरी बात है कि अभी दूसरे रवाएं तो नहीं आप एक इंस्टीट्यूशन को दूसरे से, भी हम उस इंस्टीट्यूशन की कदर करते हैं और हम चाहते हैं कि वो हमारी कदर करें, और हम जहां तक कोशिश करें एक दूसरे, वो हमारे कानून जो बनाए हम उनको सराहें जहां तक मुमकिन है, और वो हमारे फैसलों पे।
Entry 55. अब I think अब separation and independence we move on to entry 55.
आगे बढ़ेंगे।
You see, as the Honorable Chief Justice said, there is one question. Actually, I had posed two questions. The stages, well, they are the stages of the same question. The first question was, you have to show that the Parliament is competent. It is a question of competency. But the probe doesn't end there. Even if the Parliament is competent, some provision of the law is in conflict with the Constitution, it can still be struck down. So
I stand corrected. दो क्वेश्चन थे, ठीक है।
You would not only have to answer the question of competence, you would also have to take us to each provision and justify that it is not in conflict with any provision of the Constitution. So keep that in mind and please proceed.
My Lord, with us, I thought their constitutionality is assumed. The party shows that this provision is unconstitutional, and then I defend that provision. It seems so that all of the provisions have so far.
You think the burden is on the person challenging it, and the burden does not lie on you to justify it.
Yes, and then if the burden is
since the question has been posed, so you can see.
And I'm assuming from this question,
so you can answer
my Lord's estimation that burden
I assume you're not going to rest your case by saying they failed to discharge the burden.
My Lords, now, with this question, I actually wanted to move to entry 55, but this question is something I'll come back to. I'll then come back to it because just appeal ki baat ho.
Go at your own pace and according to your
if my lords, if I may take your lordships to entry 55 now, and my reading of entry 55.
अच्छा, पहले ये वजाहत कर दें, क्योंकि एक राय है कि 55 है, दूसरा है 58 है, दूसरा है, तीसरी राय है कि 58 है, मगर 58 ना भी है तो 55 फिर भी है। तो आपका क्या स्टैंड है?
मेरी राय में, as far as section 5 is concerned, it is rooted in entry 55, and the other provisions are to be construed under Article 142A, read with 58, and then back to 191.
So what?
As far as entry 55 is concerned, it may be read with entry 175 clause 2 and entry 55.
What was very aptly put by your predecessor in the line of arguments, Mr. Faisal Siddiqui, that it's a ping-pong effect. It goes from 58 to 191. Back to Article
58 is a gateway. I mean, 142, where everything starts, takes you to the list. 58 brings you back to the Constitution. 1 through 57 keeps you there. So that is how I see. I see how the Constitution is functioning. So entry 55, my lords. Now, there are two parts, but I read these two parts somewhat differently than how my predecessor had read out. I read it first 2 and then I submit how I read it and then make my submissions. Jurisdiction and powers of all courts except the Supreme Court with respect to any of the matters in this list and to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution. I'll take a pause here. And the enlargement of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and the conferring thereon of supplemental powers. My Lord, my reading of entry 55 is that the last two parts, the enlargement of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and the powers with the except the Supreme Court. And insofar as jurisdiction and power of all courts are concerned, I read it, jurisdiction and power of all courts with respect to any of the matters in this list and to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution. So this term, to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution, is in relation to all courts except the Supreme Court.
So you're saying the
For the
enlargement
purposes
of jurisdiction
is for
should
the
not be
Supreme
read
Court.
with expressly authorized by or under the
Yes,
Constitution?
yes.
I didn't get this point. I didn't get this point.
What
Well-
you're saying is, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, the enlargement can only be done where there is specific authorization.
No,
You're saying otherwise.
I'm saying otherwise.
You're saying for the Supreme Court, you don't need any express authorization. It is
For the Supreme
assumed.
Court, there can only be enlargement, and we have to go to the language, and there is no such thing as far as
Express authorization की जरूरत नहीं है.
सो सुप्रीम कोर्ट के लिए ये अप्लाई नहीं करेगा, हाई कोर्ट्स के लिए करेगा. वो इसलिए करेगा बिकॉज हाई कोर्ट्स में देर आर not just high courts, all courts, because there are three sorts of courts which are dealt with under the
No, but you are saying to
must be
read
somewhere.
jurisdiction and powers of all courts to such extent as expressly authorized by or under the Constitution.
With respect to any-
Yes, so you're saying read the jurisdiction and powers of all courts with expressly authorized by the
so
Constitution.
let me just
Where is it expressly authorized by the
जी बोलिए, मैं उस पे आऊंगा. I would read with respect to any of the matters in this list and this is in conjunction with, to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution, and then the comma is separating what is to be done in so far as Supreme Court is
So there's no restriction on enlargement of jurisdiction as you read.
of the Supreme Court.
Then
Yes.
what happens to expressly authorized by, I'm not.
No, this in my respectful submission, this is something which relates to the high courts, administrative courts and federal Sharia court.
Okay, so you mean the bar is lower for the Supreme Court and
There
higher
is a
for
reason.
the other.
No, there is a reason. Because as far as jurisdiction and power of all courts are concerned, it can be done through statute, but only to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution.
No, but then-
And in relation to the matters in this list.
Because that can be curtailed.
Yes.
But in case of the Supreme Court, its
It can't be curtailed, and if let me just walk you through Article 199 and then 212 and let's just.
Let me read this entry 55 just to make sure I have understood, because I'm sorry, I'm still having some difficulty here. So as you read it, jurisdiction and powers of all courts except the Supreme Court with respect to any of the matters listed in this court and to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution.
So the and used after
And
used
and the
No, there is no
enlargement, the enlargement of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and the conferring thereon on supplemental powers. That you say is separate from this.
So as Justice Attar just pointed out, you're saying that it actually turns on the word enlargement because there's a specific thing that the power could be given, that is enlargement, so we don't need to worry about any extent or anything because it's merely restoring, enlarging, it's not reducing, it's not altering, it's enlarging. So that's as simple as that. It doesn't have the...
Your reading eliminates the word and surely
and from.
from the text.
So there are two ands here. One is
So
after
first
the
one-
list,
No, the first one.
the and, yes.
Jurisdiction and, sorry, the first one is jurisdiction and powers of all courts
With
except
respect to any of the matters in the list
with any
and,
of the matters of the list.
and
नहीं, अगर आप अब आगे जो चीज आ रही है उसको पीछे से जोड़ रहे हैं तो ये एंड तो फिर एलिमिनेट हो गया।
एंड के साथ वो कंजंक्टिव हो रहा है ना सर,
एंड नहीं,
इन कंजंक्शन हो रहा है ना, एंड टू सच एक्सटेंट एज इज
एंड इट मेक्स इट डिसजंक्टिव, एंड की तो जरूरत ही नहीं रहती ना। अगर इस ना पढ़े, jurisdiction and powers of all courts except the Supreme Court with respect to any of the matters in this list to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution. Is there any grammatical problem with this? Is there any grammatical problem? No. So therefore, on your reading, and is eliminated. And becomes redundant. And makes sense only if it creates the break and then relates such extent as expressly authorized by the Constitution to what is following. आप समझ रहे हैं ना?
What is following after and?
अगर आप and की जरूरत नहीं रहती ना आपकी रीडिंग पे।
and की जरूरत देखें, अब यहाँ
दोबारा पढ़ता हूँ, चलिए दोबारा पढ़ते हैं।
On that count, my lord, and
दोबारा पढ़ते हैं ना, दोबारा पढ़ते हैं। और अंडर के
ऊपर मैं इसकी आपको कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में भी लेके जाऊंगा to make sense of it.
Jurisdiction and powers of all courts except the Supreme Court with respect to any of the matters listed in this, any of the matters in this list, to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution. Full stop. Is there any error, any grammatical error in this sentence?
No, it could be read as
therefore and becomes
and that is
मैंने full stop भी डाल दिया just to clarify.
There is a reason. There is a reason. अब मैं इसको
and किधर गया?
इसको जरा करेंगे ना, समझेंगे इस तरह से कि there are two jurisdiction जो courts पे grant हो रही है. One is with respect to the matters in the list, and one we have to go to the Constitution, what the Constitution view of the Constitution, and for that, my lord may kindly turn to Article 212, for example. Let's go to 212, let's go to 199. Let's go to 199 first and then see what is the authorization, the extent of authorization as far as high courts is concerned.
उसमें तो जरूरत ही नहीं ना
नहीं है, जरूरत है।
क्या जरूरत?
Clause 5 देखेंगे उसमें। Clause 5 of Article 195. 199. The extent to which Article 199 applies, and there is carved out.
Mr. Attorney General, I mean, before looking at 55, I mean, we might lose ourselves in the grammar of it, but larger than that is perhaps the word enlargement.
Yes.
What is actually happening? You're enlarging the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It requires no extent because it is a positive thing that you're just adding to the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. So वो उसके साथ पढ़ना, वो उसके कोई
respectful submission है कि नहीं पढ़ना होगा, वो फिर काउंटर इंटूटिव है। उसलिए भी काउंटर इंटूटिव है कि there is nothing in 184, 185, 185 में 2D है which says that through an act of parliament आप उसको ऊपर ले जाएं उस अमाउंट को या रिव्यू के अंदर
इसको आप इतना दोबारा मैं
इसलिए there is nothing जो प्रोवाइड कर रहा है कि एक्सटेंड क्या है, whereas in the case of high courts for example there is an provided for the administrative tribunals also there is an extent which is provided.
Powers of all courts except the Supreme Court with respect to any of the matters in this list and to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution. Full stop. आप इतना पढ़ रहे हैं उसको?
और इसको जी हाँ,
इसमें
Constitution के बाद कॉमन
on this grammatically speaking for myself there is an expectation कि इसके बाद भी कुछ आएगा. अगर and हो ना तो उसके बाद एक expectation है and to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution. Full stop creates a vacuum because there is an expectation to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution. What?
yes. So you
लेकिन तो आपका and जो है ना
इसको एक सेकंड के लिए
मैं आपकी बात समझने की कोशिश कर रहा
मैं आपको समझाने
and में ये प्रॉब्लम है. अगर and इस तरह आप रखते हैं ना and निकाल दे तो कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है.
इसको जरा इस तरह से पढ़े, and की निकालने की जरूरत, and क्यों जरूरत है and को रखना. So let's just read it again. Jurisdiction and power of all courts with respect to any of the matters in this list. Let's take a pause here. All courts is in the list, and then and to such extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution. Full stop. So my submission is that this language and the express authorization is necessary because 199 applies the constitutional jurisdiction of high courts in terms of territory, of course, but then there is a carve out, the persons to whom this jurisdiction can be applied. And then 212, Article 212.
Do we need a professor? Do we need to make amicus a professor of the English language, Mr. Attorney General?
Why not?
I think we can understand it whatever we understand it to mean. And can I just ask a question? Does the Supreme Court have power to enlarge its own jurisdiction? Yes or no?
No.
We are saying that Parliament, their side is Parliament can only do so through constitutional amendment. Now, I don't know why you are skirting the issue.
The Supreme Court is required to or is bound to act in accordance with the...
It cannot enlarge its jurisdiction, correct?
Yes.
How has the Supreme Court enlarged its jurisdiction in cases decided by 3-member benches, by adding on benches, and which jurisdiction was assumed then? There have been recent examples of the Supreme Court creating, not just enlarging jurisdiction, but creating jurisdiction not envisaged in the Constitution. But those are sensitive matters, so you won't talk about them.
I want to talk something about it. I know, I want to talk something about it. Yeah. And let me just talk about it. And
why was you field another question? You can't field 5 questions simultaneously. You have to finish one.
So I have to field this question and then I'll come back.
Why did they use the word expressly? अगर expressly नहीं भी होता, by और under का यानी इसका मतलब हुआ कि by के लिए भी express होना चाहिए. So by in itself is always express.
वो मेरा इसलिए there are two. Yeah. One is where the Constitution now, when the term by is used, the enactment, in this case the Constitution, directly provides for what can and cannot be done. And under is where an additional act is required in an
मैं
act of
आपसे एक
parliament.
सवाल इससे आगे जा रहा हूँ. मैं ये कह रहा हूँ.
This is his 4th visit in Pakistan. He last visited Pakistan